Our first panel is entitled Diaz-Canel, Maduro and Ortega, Why Are They Still in Power? Our panelists include Victor Shih, an expert on the politics of Chinese banking policies, fiscal policies, and exchange rates, as well as elite politics of China. Victor is an associate professor of political economy at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS. Victor is an expert on the political economy of authoritarian regimes with special emphasis on China. He has also spent time examining the Chavez and Maduro regimes in Venezuela, so we feel he'll provide good perspective for this forum. Our next speaker will be Javier Corrales, professor of political science at Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts. He obtained his PhD from political science from Harvard. Javier's research focuses on democratization, presidential powers, ruling parties, democratic backsliding, popularism, political economy of development, oil and energy, and also issues of sexuality in the Americas. Javier has a forthcoming book entitled Autocracies Rising, coming out this summer, that discusses the transition to authoritarianism in Venezuela since 2010s, with comparisons to Colombia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua. Following Javier, our next speaker will be William LeoGrande, who is a professor of government at American University and a specialist in Latin American politics and U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America. Professor LeoGrande has been a frequent advisor to governments and the private sector. He's written 5 books. Most recently, he co-authored a book entitled Back Channel to Cuba, the Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. At this time, it gives me great pleasure. Oh, and finally, we have Richard Feinberg, who is a professor of political economy at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Victor Shih, who will start off our session. Victor, take it away.
Thank you, Richard, for this kind introduction. And also, I'd like to thank my other colleague, Richard Feinberg, for inviting me to this event. Unfortunately, I can't be here live, but, of course, the survivability of authoritarian regimes is a topic that I've thought a great deal about over the years, culminating to an edited book that I did entitled Economic Shocks and Authoritarian Stability. So that came out a couple of years ago. And so today, what I'm going to do is to introduce the framework that we have in the book and then talk a little bit about especially the case of Venezuela under Maduro. As most of you remember, a couple of years ago, there was an effort mainly conducted by opposition within the country, but also with the encouragement and maybe even support of the US government to conduct regime change. It ultimately did not work. So perhaps applying the framework that I have may reify some aspects of that episode. So as most of you know, in the existing literature on authoritarian regimes, authoritarian stability, a great deal of emphasis has been put on institutionalization. So a lot of scholars in comparative politics have made the argument that if authoritarian regimes have institutions, power-sharing institutions, and party structure, it can really basically provide stable expectations to the ruling elite that they will receive payoffs into the future. A party structure, in addition, will help the rulers of a regime to, this is kind of the Beatrice Magaloni argument, distinguish between competent and incompetent lieutenants. And then also, according to sort of Milan Zvolik's by now sort of classic argument, provide incentives for especially junior level lieutenants to conduct tasks ordered by the dictators in order to get promotions. And so having that kind of party structure really helps with incentivizing people to remain loyal to the regime and to not defect. Of course, there's been a large literature, including, by our colleague, Steph Haggard, of course, on, during moments of economic crises and economic shocks, potentially everything changes. The calculus of people who support the regime also changes because their expected payoff, both today and also into the future, changes. Potentially not supporting the regime anymore, or maybe even supporting the opposition, becomes a rational course of action during an economic crisis. So in the book, we argue that it's not so simple. Actually, if you look at episodes of economic shocks in established authoritarian regimes, in many cases, and potentially, and we didn't do this sort of careful statistical counting of, what constituted institutionalized regimes, and after economic crises, the percentage of them that survived. All I would say is that a surprisingly large number of them survived these ordeals, and sometimes even very severe economic shocks, as was the case of Iraq after the first Gulf War. And so our chapter in the book was written by Lisa Blades, of course, the leading authority of countries in the Middle East. And even in the case of Iraq, what happened was that instead of having disgruntled elites, suddenly, suddenly the resources available to the regime shrank tremendously. Of course, Iraq was an economy that largely depended on export of oil. Suddenly, they could no longer legally export oil to other countries. There were black market channels, but overall, the amount of oil and the revenue derived from oil sales collapsed, or shrank dramatically. It didn't go to zero, just today, like the case of Russia today. It doesn't go to zero overnight, but it shrinks dramatically in the case of Iraq. So what Saddam Hussein did was, instead of cutting benefits to all of his supporters equally, he reduced benefits to some of his supporters, the sort of the Sunni community writ large, cut those benefits tremendously. But for people in his core support group, those from around Tikrit, the city of Tikrit, he continued to provide a lot of extraordinary benefits and even increase some payoffs to some of those people in some cases. So then by doing that, even with reduced benefits, he was able to stay in power. Of course, the risk of a coup, the risk of someone trying to overthrow him also increased. So basically, based on cases like this and authoritarian leaders' ability to survive these economic shocks, we come to a couple of conclusions. One is that in the traditional literature, basically, people looked at outcomes of interest as, either status quo, the regime stays in power, or there's a regime change, the regime collapses. In fact, what we find is that there's this intermediate outcome where, of course, when there's big economic shocks, there's less money to go around, something has to change. But what the dictators can often do is to reduce benefits to some members of his support coalitions, but then for other members of his support coalitions, benefits remain the same or perhaps even increase. So it's a changing of the ruling coalition, if you will. So that's kind of an intermediate outcome. And that's kind of surprising in a sense, because there's this idea of minimum winning coalition, right? So it's like, dictators don't want to waste money paying all these people to support him. Normally, he would pay the least number of people necessary to keep him in power anyway. So then how is it possible that during an economic crisis, you can stop paying a lot of people and still stay in power? It suggests a number of different possibilities, which we don't completely flesh out. But one possibility is that, during an economic crisis, your resources shrink, but those of your opponents also are shrinking. So it still doesn't, even though some people in your support coalition, they're getting less, it doesn't make sense for them to defect to the opposition because they also would get less as a member of the opposition. Another possibility is that the whole notion of minimum winning coalition is just not right. When dictators have a lot of resources, they will overhire people to support them. And so that, when there's an economic crisis, they can still cut benefits to some people and still stay in power. it's unclear which scenario sort of played out in some of these classic cases like Iraq, and certainly in the case of Venezuela, it's unclear what happened there. The second conclusion that we came to was that we looked at these cases, and this is very, very much sort of inductive reasoning. We identified three variables that are very important in terms of determining whether or not regimes can survive after an economic crisis. The first variable is the duration and severity of an economic crisis, especially the duration. So obviously, the more people expect an economic crisis to last a long time, like sanctions that are going to be in place for years and years to come, the more incentives they have to try to overthrow the incumbent or defect to the opposition, in search of higher payoffs. The shorter the crisis is, the less they're likely to do so, for the obvious reasons like, oh, well, things may be bad today, but tomorrow when the economy recovers, then I will continue to get huge amount of payments from the dictator. So that actually has a lesson for sanctions, today, which is that the world, if it wants to impose sanctions on a country, whether it be Iran or Russia or whatever, it has to make sure that the sanction regime is highly institutionalized and credibly in place for the medium term at least. Otherwise, it's basically useless, because the lieutenants of dictators will say, well, this is only going to last for a year or two. Then I can go back to sailing on my nice yachts, around the Mediterranean, etc. The second variable that we think is important is the regime's control over financial institutions. Obviously, the countries that did the best on this score included China. So China had financial crises, but then because they completely dominate the financial system, it wasn't really a problem. There's a sort of the classic case comparison between Malaysia and Indonesia, where in the case of Indonesia, during the Asian financial crisis, the government didn't have very much control over the financial industry. As a result, there was huge capital flight. In contrast, as described by Slater and others, in contrast, in Malaysia, there was effective capital control, which was one of the contributors to how the regime survived the Asian financial crisis. And then finally, we agree with the literature that political institutions matter. So party institutionalizations, those obviously still are working in the background to provide incentives for regime insiders to stick with the regime through thick and thin, so to speak. So I'll just apply our insights into the case of Venezuela very briefly. I don't know the case super well, so I just come up with some kind of superficial observations, and I'm sure that my colleagues, the two Richards, can continue the conversation in a much more rich way than I am able to do so. So the first problem that I saw, problem in terms of the inability of the international community and the domestic opposition, their inability to carry out regime change. The first weakness is that I didn't notice too many linkages between the opposition and the military. So at the end of the day, Maduro stays in power because some segment or maybe a large segment of the military backed him. And as long as, the opposition could not make a credible promise of payoffs to a substantial segment of the military, the chance of any, push to change the regime did not have a good chance of succeeding. So for people in the military, you have to think about it this way, right? So of course, again, Venezuela had been under various kinds of oil-related sanctions for a number of years, even prior to this kind of volatile period of 2018, 2019. So, obviously the payoffs to members of the military have been in decline previous to that. But what are their alternatives, right? So there's no clear path or clear possibility for senior officers such that if they were to back the opposition and the opposition were to succeed, that they would necessarily get a higher payoff. At least I never saw anyone making them promises like that. And of course, in a democracy, things become highly uncertain. You don't even know if the new government would form like these, tribunes to try members of the military for the past misdeeds, and many of them are guilty of it, et cetera, et cetera. So unless payoffs are made to them extremely clearly, that was a problem. Or unless their existing payoffs were so low that almost any other outcome would have been better. That was the case kind of in the Eastern European militaries prior to the transition. And then it's like in the case of Germany, the West German government just promised all these guys a pension. And they're like, oh, a West German pension? Sounds good to me. I'll take that. And that was kind of enough. And then also the other factor that I heard about was that there were these Cuban advisors, or secret police types on the ground, watching over the troops, watching over officers, kind of like a political commissar system to make sure that they remain loyal to the regime. So that might have been the case, and that certainly works. And basically, the way is similar to kind of a Saddam Hussein, where he would give extraordinary payoffs to both, close relatives and also these sort of secret police types, so that they can watch over the rest of the military. So even with a lot of reduced resources, as long as you pay the secret police sufficiently, they can help you watch over, members of the military to make sure that they don't deviate. This is a sort of a classic trick that, a lot of countries use, North Korea, the Soviet Union, when it was still the Soviet Union, maybe even today, China has a commissar system. And it seems like there was kind of that system in place in Venezuela also. Anyway, I don't know the case super well, but I think, one mistake that some people make is that, when they think about regime survivability or potential for transition, there's too much focus on the opposition, potential opposition, their size, their willingness. That's very important, of course. But ultimately, most regimes collapse because some segment of the regime insiders defect to the opposition. So the incentives of regime insiders to defect also, is very important. So I'll leave it at that. And, again, I wish I could join in real time, but I have a conflict in my schedule. And I will certainly watch the recording to hear the Q&As and the other, panelists.
Thank you, Victor. At this time, I want to welcome Javier Corrales, professor of political science from Amherst, to our virtual stage. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Richard, and all the organizers and the technical group. They've been great helping us get started, and delighted to have heard Victor's remarks and to be sharing this panel with the great Cuban scholar, Bill. What I thought I would do is let me start out by discussing for about 4 minutes or so a little bit the 3 cases, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and then dwell a little bit longer on Venezuela. And I hope this isn't too, that this doesn't go beyond my allotted time. All right, so let's first do the common denominators, the answer to the question of why are these regimes still in place. And I think they all have the similarity of, the repression is there. It's very important we don't forget that. And they have been they continue to use repression when necessary. And also they have the exit mechanism. This is the possibility of leaving. So they have this in common. But like Victor was telling us, in the study of authoritarian regime survival, we have needed to go beyond that, because even regimes that engage in repression and have exit communities, not all of them survive. So what could be happening here? Now, it's important to know that there are different stages of longevity, and this, of course, affects. Now, let me just say something very quickly about Cuba. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say what I think is really the most important factor. This doesn't mean that it's the only factor for each of these cases, but it's worth, I want to be able to share what I think. In the case of Cuba, I continue to argue that an important aspect of the survival of the regime is what I call, and others have called, the second embargo, which are the restrictions that the Cuban government imposes on the construction of independent wealth. These restrictions, as Richard Feinberg has well documented, have eased significantly. That's absolutely true. We're not in the command economy era of even when Fidel Castro was there. But we still don't really have a society, a civil society, let alone a middle class, with the wealth necessary to rise up. It's just not there. The regime has the institutions to prohibit the development of independent wealth. The embargo, the US embargo, of course helps, but my sense is that the Cuban domestic embargo is really the issue here. Apologies for that. In the case of Nicaragua, we saw with Nicaragua, and Richard Feinberg again has written so much on Nicaragua, and I may be a bit superficial here. It's an example of a process of autocratization that occurred because political parties were weak to begin with and became very weak immediately. And maybe Ortega's great contribution to the study of authoritarianism is when he came to office again in 2006. He went after the weak political parties, and for many years, Nicaragua was a country where there was no real opposition organized along political parties. There were civil society groups, but we do know that it is very difficult for civil society alone, without parties, to contain democratic backsliding in many ways. And yet, the government was developing a ruling party with a significant network of influence. So the point that Victor was making about the importance of a ruling party that is consolidated in the context of an opposition that is losing political parties, although it might be growing, is what I think the Nicaraguan case is a perfect textbook example of. Now, let me turn my attention to Venezuela, because as many of you know, I've been spending a lot of time discussing and trying to think about Venezuela. And let me begin by saying that that I want to agree with Victor's point, 2 points, that it is very difficult to encourage regime change with external sanctions. I am Cuban American. I come from a tradition of believing that sanctions can do the job. And I have to be honest and say that I have changed my mind, because I think the evidence tells us that if economic sanctions don't topple regimes right away, these regimes figure out a way to survive with it. It's sort of like you have one or two opportunities to do this, and if you don't, like, it's sort of like going bowling. If you don't strike, you just won't. And because regimes do exactly what Victor was saying, which is under economic restrictions, they basically provide more resources to some key groups that are necessary, and then they deny resources to other groups. But by being able to co-opt still a little bit and figure out ways of bypassing these restrictions, they develop new survival techniques. So what we are seeing is not a real surprise at this moment, but now a case where economic sanctions didn't work. And that's really what other cases are telling us. There are, of course, exceptions. The South Africa example is always the exception that people bring to mind. But for the most part, embargoes can force authoritarian regimes to change some policies, like perhaps stop a war or release some dissidents, but very seldom do they topple authoritarian regimes. So that's the first thing I wanted to say about Venezuela. Now, the other point that Victor made, which I think is worth highlighting and that I also agree with, is that what you need to be able to understand is how do authoritarian governments prevent a big defection, and especially a defection of the military. But not just the military, important sectors, civilian groups. When the regime is facing opposition and has to make the decision to repress, all these supporters of the regime at the top need to make a very hard decision. Do we side with the president repressing, or do we say enough is enough, let's defect and let's now turn against the president? We now know what happened in Venezuela during the period of maximum pressure, during the period of the Guaido uprising, which went from 2019 to about 2021. This defection didn't happen in a significantly large institutional way. There were many defections and there was dissent and it was repressed, but the key allies of the government at the very top remained coherent. And so in the book that I'm writing and that Richard Kai was kind enough to mention, and I'll be self-promotional enough to mention it again, there's a chapter where I talk about the concept that I called function fusion. Let me say a little bit about this, because this is what I think Maduro did to prevent defection. Victor was discussing the strategy, the toolkit that some dictators employ of essentially rewarding key allies with special economic favors when things get tough. What I have discovered is that in the case of Venezuela, it became harder to do so because really the sanctions and the economic depression of the country were absolutely insane, and there were not enough economic resources to keep the key allies economically happy. So what Maduro decided instead is what I called function fusion, which is to tell institutions that existed in Venezuela and grant them new governing functions, functions that one would normally associate with other institutions. He would fuse the institutions of other institutions with those existing institutions. So let me give you an example, a few examples. The military in Venezuela, for example, was following the Cuban model during the Maduro period, given increasingly more economic functions. They were turned into business entrepreneurs in many ways, and they also became in charge of the oil industry as well as an illicit industry. So the military gets economic functions, business functions. Civilians also got enhanced military functions. We're all familiar with colectivos. Colectivos are paramilitary groups. And the interesting thing about it is that Maduro promoted the rise of civilians with huge military functions. And this was absolutely great for these colectivos because they became sheriffs and gangsters promoted by the state. And that allowed them to stay loyal to Maduro. Judges in Venezuela have been allowed to become vendors of the state. I have been able to get data showing, well, I've been able to find folks in Venezuela who have documented that there are many judges who become the owners of companies that sell to the state. Ruling party members, when they, for example, become governors or mayors, if they are very loyal, they become real dictators, maybe more dictatorial than Maduro himself within their jurisdiction. Maduro grants them a significant degree of autonomy within their jurisdiction to do as they please, including perhaps participating in illicit functions and having their own deals with the private sector, whatever there is, and even external foreign actors. Communal councils, which was one of the big inventions of Hugo Chavez, which were supposed to be communities dealing with economic problems at the local level. Eventually, they morphed into little cells of the ruling party. But what Maduro does is take many of these communal councils and he gives them the functions of being the enforcers of welfare. They are the ones who begin to determine who's going to get assistance during the economic crisis, who is going to be receiving them. And they were in charge essentially of deciding, you get it, and because you're going to get it, you need to return a favor to me. So he uses communal councils to weaponize the welfare state. And finally, another example of function fusion, and this is really one of the most extraordinary. I don't know that all authoritarian regimes do this, but this is still nevertheless part of the same concept. That is, Maduro has done something remarkable. He has allowed foreign actors to basically exercise state powers within Venezuelan territory, and especially illicit actors. There are reports, for example, of the guerrillas from Colombia operating in Venezuela, especially prior to 2021. And they're operating in a way that they almost seem like state actors. They're providing services, but they're also repressing. They're conducting official economic transactions and they're conducting unofficial economic transactions. They engage in formal violence and informal violence. So by Maduro granting these actors this autonomy to operate almost as state actors, these forces were immediately converted into very loyal to the regime. So those are some of the examples. You're probably thinking, well, okay, this is probably too extreme. And I agree that it is too extreme and very risky. In fact, absolutely risky, because you might be generating, in the process of co-opting them by giving them more governance structures, you're eroding your own base. No, you're eroding your own capacity to maintain unitary control of the system. That is absolutely true. But in the short and medium term, function fusion allowed Maduro to survive the economic catastrophe that resulted from the collapse of the oil industry, the collapse of the formal economy, and then the sanctions, and then the economic drain from the migration crisis. Because there was very little money to move things around, he had to be creative. And what he ended up doing was to eventually give out parcels of governance to all these institutions by giving them functions that would belong to other institutions, the way that we in political science think of the functions of institutions. And by giving them more functions without necessarily giving them more money, more tangibles, he was able to win their loyalty. Those were really my remarks. I know my time is up and I am going to stop right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce again William LeoGrande, Professor of Government from American University. William, take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Richard, and thanks to the Institute for organizing this really interesting webinar. It's a great pleasure to be with you and with my colleagues on the panel. You know, in the research that's been done on authoritarian resilience, one of the findings is that regimes that have origins in social revolutions tend to be more resilient over time. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that they have a kind of foundational legitimacy. A revolution that is widely popular when it happens has a kind of carryover effect in terms of the legitimacy of the regime. Now, obviously, that doesn't last forever. It tends to decay over time with demographic changes and also with the accumulated shortcomings of the regime once it's in power. In Cuba, we can see this very, very clearly with the attitudinal gap between the older generations, which either lived through the insurrection of 1959 or came of age during the early years of the revolution, the 1970s and perhaps even into the 1980s, when there was a kind of deep enthusiasm for the social changes that were underway. And you compare their attitudes, which tend to still be supportive of the regime, with that of younger generations, particularly people who came of age during or after the special period, which is what the Cubans call the incredible economic depression that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, the gaps in attitudes are extraordinary. Those younger generations pose a real political problem for the regime because they tend to be extremely critical of it. Another element that tends to bolster the legitimacy of authoritarian regimes that have revolutionary origins is nationalism, because nationalism usually is a key component for putting together a revolutionary coalition in the first place. And it can then be used by the regime as a continuing legitimizing instrument, if you will. Now, this is obviously very clear in the case of Cuba, where the regime has been blaming the United States for its problems for the last 60 years. And of course, the United States contributes to that by continuing to have a policy of hostility and economic sanctions. But I think you can see that nationalism has also been part of the appeal of both the Nicaraguan government and the Venezuelan government. Charismatic leadership plays a role in some authoritarian regimes, reinforcing, again, regime legitimacy. This idea, particularly of the first generation of revolutionary founders who achieved what at the time seemed to be the impossible of overthrowing the prior authoritarian regime, they often tend to have a deep personal legitimacy and following. Again, Fidel Castro, of course, is the classic example of this, probably one of the most charismatic political figures of the 20th century. I think Hugo Chavez, to a certain extent, had a similar role in Venezuela. Certainly, he built an initial constituency around that. Ortega, less so, although remember that the Sandinistas party originated, of course, in a revolutionary struggle. It's important to understand, I think, though, that in all these cases of revolutionary charismatic authority, there's also usually more involved than just the charismatic personal characteristics of the leaders. Usually, it's also connected to actual policy changes in which early in the revolutionary process, there is dramatic social change that benefits certain constituencies. And in these cases, because these are left-wing movements, tended to benefit the poorer segments of the population. And that tends to then cement in a degree of support from the lower classes for these regimes, even down the road when the regimes are having trouble and no longer, if you will, delivering the goods. So, and another reason, of course, for the resilience of all authoritarian regimes, and this is something that both Victor and Javier talked about, is the question of who benefits. Like all regimes, some people benefit from the status quo. In the Cuban case, of course, and I will say, in communist systems historically, and I'm thinking especially of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, there was what analysts call a social compact. That is to say, the regime delivered benefits to the general public, free education, free healthcare, guarantees of minimum consumption, and in exchange, the population was willing to accept an authoritarian political system. In Eastern Europe, this was known as goulash communism. And of course, when the governments in Eastern Europe stopped delivering on that promise, it undermined their legitimacy and was an important contributor to the changes of 1989 and the collapse of those regimes. Of course, some constituencies in an authoritarian regime benefit directly, and Javier talked about this at some length in the Venezuelan case. And when I say benefit, I mean not just through public goods, but privately. Bureaucracies, both state and party bureaucracies, benefit from the status quo in these regimes. The payoffs that they get, as Javier was describing, and Victor as well. In the Cuban case, it's precisely these bureaucracies that are wedded to the status quo that have actually been an obstacle even to incremental reform, even to the economic reforms that the regime has tried to pursue over the last few years. In Venezuela, many people wondered why it was that the armed forces didn't overthrow Maduro as the economy descended into chaos and hyperinflation. And I think Javier has already told us the answer. The armed forces benefited financially. They were among the biggest recipients of the payoffs that Maduro handed out to his supporters. And consequently, they were loyal to the regime. I think also there was a concern, and this is something Victor mentioned, about in the aftermath of regime collapse, would the armed forces become subject to recriminations by a new government? And naturally, if they were benefiting reasonably well under Maduro and risked serious consequences for their past actions in the event of a regime change, naturally the armed forces sided with the regimes. So why do oppositions fail? So first of all, I think, and again, people have mentioned this, Javier in particular mentioned the export of opposition. The fact that it's easier in a number of these cases to choose exit over voice, to use Hirschman's formulation. This has been especially true in the Cuban case, where we have seen successive waves of large-scale migration off the island to the United States. Also true in the Venezuelan case, as all of the surrounding countries that have had to take up these refugees can attest. And I think we're seeing more of that from Nicaragua as well. A second reason that opposition movements have had a hard time gaining traction is, again, the issue of nationalism. Regimes can, in appealing to nationalism, brand their opponents as vendepatrias, traitors. And this, again, has been very clear in the Cuban case, where all opposition, in effect, has been branded as anti-nationalist and essentially conscious or unconscious agents of US imperialism. The Cuban government constantly calls its opponents annexationists, referring back to a mid-19th century movement of Cubans who wanted to join the United States as a state and give up statehood in Cuba entirely. And once again, this is a weakness in the opposition that is unintentionally and ironically reinforced by the fact that the United States spends $20 million a year funneling resources to the opposition, which makes them, from the regime's point of view, all paid agents of Cuba's enemy. We see nationalist appeals in both the Nicaraguan and Venezuelan cases as well, of course, and efforts to brand the opposition as just stalking horses for a return of American domination. Repression is really built on organizational capacity, and the ability of an opposition movement to resist or overcome repression depends on their organizational capacity. In the Cuban case, there was essentially no organized opposition of any kind from about 1965 to the 1990s. And there's very little even today. And this is because at the very beginning of the revolution, the revolutionary government essentially eliminated independent civil society for all intents and purposes. And it's only really in the last couple of decades that there has been sufficient space for the beginnings of development of civil society more broadly, but it's very constrained when it comes to issues of opposition. So the government today in Cuba is willing to tolerate the creation of civil society organizations that don't challenge the fundamental basis of the system. So for example, there are animal rights groups, there are LGBTQ plus groups, there are feminist groups. A wide variety of organizations have grown up in the last couple of decades, but opposition political movements and opposition political parties continue to be subject to the same very high level of harassment and repression that they were in previous years. Venezuela and Nicaragua are a little different in this regard, of course, because the opposition was never totally dismantled in those cases. Hence, you see more active opposition. So you see much larger organized demonstrations historically, that is to say, in the last 2 decades. And that in turn has elicited more violent repression. The Cuban opposition movement has never been able to put together the resources necessary, the organizational capacity necessary, or the popular support, frankly, necessary to pose a significant challenge to the regime. And one of the reasons, reasons most recently of the failure of the effort to organize a nationwide demonstration last November was the fact that the opposition tried to organize it entirely on Facebook. So Facebook is a social media group. It's not an organization, and it's not capable of pulling together anything more really than a few one-off kinds of demonstrations. And the demonstrations last November, the combination of a lack of effective organization, a failure to appeal to the grievances that most Cubans have, which are economic, not about artistic or political expression, and then the repression that the government used led to an utter failure of any organized demonstrations last November, despite several months of leading up to it. And finally, I will say that at the end of the day, the only way you see a kind of people's power revolution of mass uprising, like you saw in Eastern Europe, like you saw in the Philippines, like we've seen in the color revolutions, is if the security forces defect. If security forces remain loyal, the regime survives. And that I would argue is the difference between Eastern Europe in 1989 and Tiananmen Square in 1989. And in the 3 cases we're talking about today, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, there is really no indication that the security forces in either of those 3 cases are on the verge of defection. Thanks.
Thank you, William. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Feinberg. As I mentioned, he's a professor of international political economy at the School of Global Policy and Strategy here at UC San Diego. Richard has a career that spans both the public sector, the private sector, and also as academic and as the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine's Western Hemisphere book review section. He's also the principal architect of the 1994 Miami Summit of the Americas under the Clinton administration. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Richard, who will finish off this panel. Richard, take it away.
Thanks, Richard. Really a great pleasure to be on this panel and to follow my colleagues, Victor, Javier, and Bill, who have all laid out really brilliant and very succinct responses to the questions of how is it that these 3 authoritarian regimes are still in place, despite all the pressures, internal and particularly external, that they have been facing. Really, the idea behind this panel is to confront some inconvenient truths, because a lot of the discussion, I think, in the United States recently, but over many years in the case of Cuba, have had this assumption somehow that, these regimes are really quite fragile, and if the international actors were just a little cleverer or a little tougher, that these regimes would crumble. And yet they endure what in Asia in particular is referred to as authoritarian resilience. So the idea behind this panel is to sober up the debate, to recognize that, hey, these regimes have endured, and there are reasons that they have endured. And you've heard a lot of the reasons just laid out. Maybe pulling them together, I have what I call these regimes rest on 3 pillars, if you will. And the presentations that just preceded me expand on some of this in a way. But one, of course, obviously, is the security apparatus. And it's emphasized if they hang tough together, very, very hard, almost impossible to overthrow them. Security apparatus being military, but also police and paramilitaries, colectivos or turbas or whatever. What's happened in these regimes that have now been in place for at least 15 years in the case of Nicaragua, 20 years in the case of the Chavistas, and 60 years in the case of Cuba. They've had time to purge any dissident elements within the security apparatus and to promote loyalty, their friends and colleagues from within. These institutions, of course, are very hierarchical, and it makes defections hard. I also think back in the old days, you might have been able to, you might have expected to see Colonel coups or something. I think we're seeing less of those in part because of IT. You really can track and listen in on and catch early in the game any plotters these days. So security apparatus. Secondly, broadly speaking, the public sector. Now, Javier elaborated on this, but basically 20 to 30% of the labor force works in the public sector. They have control over lots of resources. You can put them in control of, for example, delivering consumer products in a repression situation, or an economic recession situation. And so these folks, even when the overall economy declines, they still think their perks, their positions, that in the public sector are more than the outsiders have. And so therefore, they don't have that incentive to defect. So the big public sector, and if there are elections of different varieties, you start off with 20 to 30% of the vote, people working and their families working in the public sector. Then the third, of course, is a political party. And that was mentioned, but not as strongly as I might have thought, given we just heard from some political scientists. But the Cuban Communist Party is maybe not what it doesn't have the strength, the loyalty, the ideological impact that it had in earlier years, but it is still there, and it's still by far the strongest political organization in town. And similarly, the Chavistas and the Sandinistas, who, as Bill emphasized, do have this legacy of revolutionary legitimacy, etc. And these political parties perform a number of roles, which is loyalty. They can mobilize the populations. They can distribute resources to the party loyalists, etc. So those are the three pillars that I really sort of emphasize: security apparatus, public sector, and political party. Now, together, what they can do is gain control over the means of communication. And I think that's something perhaps we haven't emphasized as much yet in this panel. But in all cases, immediately in the case of the Cuban Revolution, but gradually over time in Venezuela and in Nicaragua, the regimes have taken over much of the media, and they can exercise various censorship or surveillance over internet activity as well. We've seen, by the way, that IT, cell phones, et cetera, cut in both directions, right? They do allow, as Bill suggested, maybe some spontaneous gatherings, but then all that information on everyone's cell phone is turned against the demonstrators as they are gradually hunted down by the security apparatus. So I think the whole issue of information control, propaganda, which may be rooted in history, as Bill suggested, or invented, as in the case of more in the case of Nicaragua these days. But in any case, and then of course, absolutely defaming the opposition, calling them every sort of obscenity. So another way to think about this is you can have a revolution from above or a revolution from below. Now, the revolution from above, that would require, as we've emphasized, splits, defections. Increasingly difficult. That's where people who emphasize surveillance, whether it comes from Cuba, whether it's Chinese, whether it's just purchased on the commercial markets these days, surveillance, I think, has a lot to do with keeping the elites together. Plus, of course, as already has been emphasized, the access to various types of resources. Particularly in the Nicaragua case, when I've asked some friends, well, Ortega sort of, he doesn't have the charisma, he's not really all that well liked, how does he hold on? And a lot of it has to do with, well, he's the guy who controls the perks, who has the files on everyone, their wealth, their positions, their family safety, all depends on El Carmen, where he's where Ortega and his wife and family are ensconced. And both for reasons of continuing access to those resources and fear of the consequences of defection, it's been hard to break. So hence revolutions from above are difficult. And revolutions from below we're seeing, I think as was emphasized also, it's very tough to pull off these days. I think we should recognize that state apparatuses, security apparatuses are more sophisticated today than they were in the 60s and 70s. They have more equipment, better training in crowd control, for example, and of course, a lot more IT capabilities. So the idea of a mass uprising to overthrow and then crack perhaps a unified elite, very, very hard to pull off. And we should also recognize that by and large, these governments, they haven't just, with a few exceptions, committed mass atrocities. They've been able to modulate the use of violence just enough to keep the opposition from controlling the streets or overwhelming the government. But they have not, for example, in general, assassinated many leading political opponents in a ways that might create a backlash against the government. Then finally, in all three cases, we see the opposition inevitably divided between, let's say, the radicals who say regime change now or nothing, and the more moderates who are willing to bargain and maybe accept something less than full-scale democratization. And those divisions, of course, are debilitating. They've been particularly critical in the case of cases both of Venezuela and of Nicaragua. If the oppositions in Nicaragua had organized themselves better and more intelligently in 2006 and 2007, for example, they could have won that election, and this whole Ortega period might not have come to fruition. But anyway, the bottom line is here, whether or not you're talking about revolution from above, cracks in the regime, or revolution from below, it seems in these three country cases, neither have proven to be feasible tactics. Then finally, we've talked a bit about the failure of external pressures. And there, Bill pointed out some reasons. I would add one or two others. Also, the surprise that these governments haven't fallen despite economic declines that actually are much deeper than the relative declines that, say, occurred in Eastern Europe, in which regimes then collapsed. So how is it that these regimes have endured despite severe and prolonged economic recession or depression? And I think we've already heard some reasons for that. But also, I would just emphasize that however little you may have, if you have a little more than the next guy, and you have a little more because you are part of the governing apparatus and the governing political party or the governing public sector or the security apparatus, you're a little better off, and you're not going to risk that differentiation. Okay, so finally, then the issue of leadership was mentioned. I think this is really important, perhaps more important than so far we've recognized. In Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, we really had extraordinary examples of charismatic leadership. Some people, we may not like these guys necessarily, but you do need to recognize how both in terms of strategy and tactics and personality are really unusually powerful personalities, an exceptional degree of charisma. Ortega doesn't have it to that degree, as I think Bill already mentioned, but he's had enough. And the other thing about him, I see him as more like the way Stalin came to power. He's a party man. He's the guy who had kept all the files, who ran the secretariat, who worked day in and day out on politics when his opponents either went back to the private sector or emigrated or whatever. And he was left standing, and he just worked at it, and that was enough for him to maintain control. So finally, so we have these three pillars. We have the inability to do revolutions from above or below, charisma, the failure of external pressures that we've already talked about. Finally, the international environment may have something to do with this. We're in a period, and we'll have a whole panel talking about the precise forms of international assistance that may be coming from abroad. But in terms of the broad ideological currents, in earlier years, there was perhaps this idea that democracy was inevitable in the Western Hemisphere and would take hold firmly. And now that's, of course, no longer necessarily the case. So we see this resurgence of a liberalism and increasing critiques of representative democracy create a more fertile international environment that helps partly explain this what we now are observing as resilient authoritarian regimes in our hemisphere. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for all our panelists. We'll get into some questions now. I want to start with the topic of communications. This was actually a point that William brought up and Richard also, and the effectiveness of IT tools for surveillance. As William pointed out, many in the opposition have used Facebook to try to organize, but then as Richard pointed out, communications, particularly in this digital age, can cut both ways. I want to sort of ask all of you if you could sort of comment on the three countries, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, on how surveillance tools are being used to repress the opposition, and the challenges the opposition face in organizing in this type of environment, particularly in light of new software tools like Pegasus is being used increasingly by many governments, including many authoritarian regimes. I don't know who wants to start.
Well, in the Cuban case, the most recent example of the use of information technology for surveillance is the demonstrations, the spontaneous demonstrations that happened on July 11 of last year, in which across Cuba, probably about 10 to 15,000 people marched in about 36 cities, complaining about the current economic situation and the government's failure to fix it. I will tell you, if you watch any videos, you'll see almost all of these people had cell phones, and they were so amazed at what was going on that they were taking live streaming the video feed to other people and to their social media accounts. And then the government harvested all of those and was able to identify people who engaged in any sort of act of disruption or violence or disrespect of police over the course of that day and the following day. And the trials that are now underway are basically, most of the evidence in those trials is video of the people engaging in these kinds of actions. The other thing the Cubans do, although they've done it for a long, long time, is because the organized opposition is so small, they basically maintain constant surveillance over the people involved in it, particularly the leadership. So their phones are tapped. They have people who sit outside their houses watching who comes and goes and where they go. So those are all very old and traditional methods. But yes, governments are actually in some ways more capable of using IT to their advantage than opponents are. Because as I said, just organizing opposition only online doesn't give you the continuity of organizational capacity, leadership, resource mobilization that you need to mount a sustained opposition to a government.
Javier, any additional thoughts?
Yes. I want to say that we want to be a little bit careful with overstating the argument about the role of information, which I completely agree is there. In the case of Cuba, as Bill has said, everybody's being tracked because of their use of social media. I'm not sure that this is so big elsewhere. But what I would say is that what the governments have done is to use media to track specific groups, and especially within the ruling party and within the military. That's where you're in real trouble. That's when you actually get caught. And Richard Feinberg was talking a lot about this. This is why we don't see the incidents of coup. We see the incidents of protest. In Cuba, they didn't last. In Venezuela and Nicaragua, they were much longer despite the media. And in many ways, the government uses other mechanisms to repress them. But the use of media is being used within the ruling party and within the military. And there it does the job. It does the job of making the regime a bit more coup-proof. Now, one other thing. I do think that the rise of protests, these uprisings from below, can be also a double-edged sword. The opposition actually, by becoming very vocal, always gives more excuses for the government to repress and for the government to accuse them of being terrorists, recalcitrant. And it's one of those tactics that in and of itself, we want to romanticize it. And it's what citizens have, but it's so extreme that it actually ends up, if they don't overthrow the government right away, if they don't produce the defection, then they actually strengthen the regime. And that, I think, is the issue here. In other words, the protests, yes, get tracked through IT, but really what ends up happening is a conventional game of you were mean to me, I'm going to be even meaner back to you. And that's what we saw.
Richard, I don't know if you have any additional
I
thoughts.
just wanted to, yeah. So yeah, I agree, of course, with what's been said. So I think we're seeing a blend of more traditional methods of surveillance and then the use of IT. So what the political parties still do is, keep tabs of people in and around their neighborhoods, and they have mechanisms for reporting voices of dissent, and that still exists, and so that's important. The idea of keeping your followers, whether they're in the military or your political party, in a bubble with information. So in Cuba, we may think Granma is terribly boring, but the party loyal read this, and so they're told what the party line is, and that's important in maintaining cohesion. So you have, I think, a continuation, in other words, of some traditional means with IT. My last point, though, is what happened to counterintelligence? In the old days, we might think, the CIA or some other intelligence operation would be able to use these various tools to crack the ruling elites. So if you go back to what happened, say, in Guatemala in 1954, we don't seem to see that capability anymore, at least not visibly. Partly, I think, the three governments we're talking about, have expelled to a large degree people that they think are linked to foreign intelligence from hostile powers. So that's part of it. And then our own capacities, or the U.S. Attention to these regimes perhaps is also degraded or eroded as well. What we might have expected to see, a colonel's coup propelled from abroad using superior intelligence, IT or intelligence techniques, that seems not to be part of the equation anymore.
Thank you, Richard. I want to turn to this topic of the opposition. Each of you have raised it, and also you've highlighted the difficulty that the opposition has in overthrowing some of these authoritarian regimes. William also spoke about the exit of or the exile of many of the opposition. In fact, in the case of Cuba and Venezuela, many are now living in South Florida and trying to influence politics in their countries from Starbucks and from their homes. But the question is, how effective is that, and how effective will the opposition in each of these countries be to ultimately achieve their aims?
Well, the Cuban exile community has been trying to overthrow the Cuban government for 60 years. And I think the bottom line is that Cuba's future is going to be decided by by people in Cuba, people who've stayed. One of the things, though, that has changed is there is much greater communication now between the exile community and people on the island, and that is because of social media. That's a change. Now, people, of course, Cuban Americans have been traveling to the island for a long time to visit family, But in terms of sort of sustained online connections through social media, that has really ramped up extraordinarily. And it can have some political effect. Again, as an example, those July 11 demonstrations from last year began in one small town on the outskirts of Havana. It was organized by a Facebook group, which is sort of a hometown association made up of people living in this small town and former residents of this small town that had moved to the United States. And it won't surprise you to know that it was the people living in the United States that were sort of the motor force behind starting a small demonstration in this town, which then grew spontaneously and enormously and spread across the country. So I would not argue that those demonstrations were primarily a result of foreign subversion, but the spark that lit the prairie fire, if you will, actually did come from the United States.
Sorry, Richard, Javier, any other thoughts?
Should I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say that I'm not. This wasn't a big point that you were making, Bill, but I wouldn't exactly say that the Cuban opposition has been trying to overthrow the Cuban regime. They have been wanting to, but this has been one of the most disconnected diasporic communities of the ones we're talking about. They do send their signals, but in fact, in the last 25 years, the Cuban American community has been more connected with humanitarian assistance than anything else, despite the reputation of the Cuban American community has of being, still in the Bay of Pigs mode. Now, the Venezuelan and the Nicaraguan community abroad has been somewhat active, and I don't think there's any scholar who will say that domestic forces should remain isolated from international ties. I mean, I don't think anybody would say that. So I don't want to start with sort of like this is a bad idea. What has happened is that we fell into the trap of the diasporic communities in Venezuela and Nicaragua getting a little bit excited with a maximum pressure policy that became in vogue again under Trump. This idea that kind of what Richard Feinberg was saying, these regimes are about to fall if we just press them a little harder. And so they were encouraging their counterparts at home to adopt what I think is the biggest mistake that the opposition made in these regimes, which was in the case of Venezuela, especially abstain from elections, and in the case of Nicaragua, the whole idea of engaging in very, very, very widespread student-led protests. So that I think has been the key issue, that you either go for protests or you go for abstention, and not enough into what Bill LeoGrande at some point was stressing, creating an internal organization, thinking strategically about how to use the institutional holes in the regime to try to gain prominence. That was a long answer to the question you asked, Richard. So let me stop.
Richard, do you have any additional thoughts?
One or two things. I think one problem that some of the oppositionists have had, and particularly in Nicaragua, is excessive dependence on the United States. That somehow their power would be dramatically augmented by US pressures or US diplomacy. And so I think, for example, when a lot of the oppositionists were arrested suddenly by Ortega about 9 months ago now, people were sort of shocked. How can the United States Embassy allow this to happen to their friends? Like somehow their association with the United States was a safety umbrella. And that proved to be an exaggeration of the power still and effectiveness of and influence of the US in these circumstances. So.
Thank you, Richard. We've got several questions from our audience. I want to get into some of those. Tim writes, don't the three pillars eventually fuse into one central column? Isn't the definition of a mature authoritarian regime total confusion of state, party, and family, gun, state, and party flag intertwined into one knot? And how do you eventually untangle all that?
Yeah.
Thank you, Tim, for that question.
Well, I guess that's directed to me since I threw out this idea of the three pillars, which I just like the visual imagery of it, you know. I mean, my point was to just, yes, of course, I'm not the first one to point out that these are important foundations of authoritarian regimes. But my point was, and the point of this panel, I think, is to explain how is it that these regimes are still standing after all of the international domestic pressures they face now over prolonged periods of time. And you know, so some people have said, oh, it's all about Fidel Castro, and as soon as he's gone, the regime collapses. Well, as Bill LeoGrande has written very eloquently, the regime, in fact, was institutionalized in ways which I've tried to explain, and similarly in the other two cases that we're looking at. So that's really the purpose of that imagery of the three pillars, but also to emphasize it's not just one. So again, some people like to say, well, Cuba is basically a military dictatorship. Well, that fails to understand some of the strengths and pillars that the regime rests on. It's not just 5 generals holding the whole thing together. So that's the idea behind defining in a little more detail these 3 pillars. But yes, they are, and they are intertwined, of course.
William, Javier, would you like to comment on the question?
I don't have anything to add. I think Richard's covered it.
Okay. Well, let me get to the next question. Victor Hugo writes, leadership was mentioned as a recurrent trait of authoritarian leaders. In your view, what role does inspirational and charismatic leadership and charisma play in general in the failing of the opposition in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua? I'll argue that in the case of Venezuela, which I know best, there has been an absence of a leader that moves the consciousness of Venezuelans at all societal levels, define a vision for the country, and truly threatens the foundations of Chavismo. Who wants to take that question?
Well,
go ahead, Bill.
I'll start. So as I said at the outset, I think charisma is always more than just the personal traits of the leader. It rests ultimately on the leader's ability to read the public and his constituencies, and then to actually deliver on a vision and a program that appeals to them. And I think, Fidel Castro was absolutely brilliant at that. If you sort of read a lot of his speeches, they are rooted in long-standing aspects of Cuban political culture, nationalism, independence, social justice, that go back 100 years from the time that he came to power. And oppositions have the opposition, at least in Cuba, has just not been able to come up with a vision which is equally compelling. And I think I mentioned this a little bit, but let me elaborate. The effort to organize nationwide demonstrations last November was organized primarily by young professionals, mostly artists and intellectuals. And the appeal that they made to motivate people to turn out for these demonstrations was greater artistic and political freedom of expression. Those are important values, absolutely. But that's not at the top of mind for most Cubans today. At the top of mind for them is, how am I going to find enough food? How many hours am I going to have to stand in line to buy basic products? Why can't the government effectively manage the economy? And the opposition had no program that spoke to those issues, and consequently, it wasn't able to mobilize people at all.
Let me add 1 or 2 points, if I could. I'm always a little uncomfortable when it's the opposition that's blamed for their inadequacies, because that's a bit blaming the victims. It's extremely difficult, as we've been pointing out, to risk your life, your your assets, your family's welfare to go up against these very, as we're emphasizing, entrenched regimes. The other point is that these regimes have systematically purged potential leaders. Fidel was famous for doing this. Hence, yeah, well, then you look around and there aren't alternative leaders, guess what? Because they've either been thrown in jail or in effect forced to exit. Now, in the case of Nicaragua, we have the very interesting case in which several, I think, quite credible leaders emerged, and Ortega, in effect, recognized that these were credible leaders that were probably about to win an election, and that's why he threw them all in jail. Now, I do think it's interesting that he hasn't, at least so far, actually assassinated them. So he still recognizes certain limits. I think he's still shown to be, let's say, rational in the sense that he's tried to modulate just the level of repression that he needs to maintain himself, but without going to such extreme measures as to perhaps create a backlash. People in Nicaragua remember very well when Somoza or his associates, let's say, assassinated the leader of the opposition in 1978, and that then was an important factor in precipitating the success of the uprising and armed revolution. The other last point I would make, the opposition has pretty much in all three countries decided they will not employ violence as a method, even though they're up against regimes which are willing to make use of their monopoly on the use of force. I think this decision to forego violence obeys several different factors. One is the state apparatus is a lot tougher and more sophisticated than it might have been in the 60s and 70s. So there's a much more formidable force that you'd be going up against. I think there's a moral argument. There was already a lot of bloodshed in all of these countries, not wanting to extend that. And then also, I think the experience that armed revolutions that succeed do not necessarily result in open, plural, liberal democracies. Because for the obvious factor, the people who have the guns may decide that, well, actually, they'd rather have a monopoly on power once they succeed. So I think all of these are factors explaining why, but nevertheless, this is something new, because back in the old days in Latin America, of course, you might have thought that and in fact, did occur in 2 out of 3 of our cases, and Chavez, of course, tried a coup himself that didn't succeed, but still the use of force. That's off the table. Self-removed by the opposition forces. I think that's historically a significant development.
Thank you. We're going to talk about international support in one of our panels tomorrow. But given that the topic of this session is about how regimes stay in power, I want to know if you could all comment briefly about the influence of China, Russia, case of Venezuela, Iran, in terms of propping up and supporting these authoritarian regimes.
Well, early in the Cuban Revolution, the Russian support, the Soviet support for Cuba's revolution was indispensable. I mean, Fidel Castro in one interview actually said that if the Soviet Union had not stepped in after the United States first imposed its embargo, the revolution could not have survived. So it was absolutely crucial. Today, though, it's actually not that crucial. Cuban trade with Russia is only about 3% of its total foreign trade. The Chinese have provided Cuba with some trade credits, but they are very reluctant to actually invest in Cuba because for them, the economy hasn't been reformed enough yet. And so Cuba doesn't really have a major external patron right now. It had Venezuela, of course, until Venezuelan oil production declined significantly. Cuba still gets a lot of oil from Venezuela at cheap prices, but only about half of what it used to get.
Richard, Javier, do you want to comment on this?
Oh, Richard, why don't you go first?
Yeah, well, as Richard Kaya noticed, that we'll have a separate panel on this. But I'm of the mind pretty much along what Bill LeoGrande suggested, which is that one should not overestimate the importance of external assistance. And that's why I so emphasized in my presentation, I think we all have, the domestic foundations and pillars of these regimes, which explain their resilience. And so that's a counterpoint to the argument of those who say, well, if we could only dissuade Russia and China from involvement, these regimes would quickly totter. And I think what we're all arguing here is that's yet one more deception, self-deception on the part of certain opposition elements.
Yeah.
I want to say that when the Soviet Union collapsed, Venezuela became the Soviet Union of Cuba and later Nicaragua. So that's the international influence that played the decisive role, as Bill was reminding us, for Cuba and Nicaragua. And it was significant. And now, who is, the question is, who has been able to underwrite the Venezuelan catastrophe? And there's no question that there hasn't been a more neoliberal government than Venezuela in terms of granting autonomy to foreign nationals operating in their oil and other industries as Venezuela, the extent to which they have transferred equity and resources to Russian, Chinese, Turkish, and other actors, including illicit actors, is unseen. Perhaps the biggest irony of our time is that these three nations that want to build them, these three regimes that want to build themselves as the epitome of anti-imperialism, have reproduced the most old-fashioned, archaic forms of imperial interventions in their countries. And this is something that we have to accept. These regimes are in office in part because they managed to get themselves superpowers to sponsor them in ways that very few countries are lucky enough to have. And even though the Soviet Union collapsed, and even though Russia is now in trouble and China has stopped providing it, there is still a significant degree to which these countries really yield way too much to these foreign powers in order to get a little bit of help from each of them.
Let me just add one point in the Nicaragua case, because we've been trying to generalize among these three cases, which I think is fascinating, but of course, at the end of the day, each case has its own special characteristics. In the case of Nicaragua, for a number of years, Venezuela was providing, relative to the size of the Nicaraguan economy, a major subsidy. And so I and others thought, well, the regime seems so dependent upon Venezuelan largesse. When that largesse collapses, is the regime going to collapse? And I think what we found is, obviously that didn't happen. There was more discontent, and the spark for the uprising in 2018 was some increase in utility rates to the population. But what we found was that the government could alter its mix of instruments. So it could, let's say, remove the face of the smiling Daniel Ortega with his pink background and his campaign posters, and he could unshield his sword and mow down several hundred students. So the point being, when you have more money, you can maintain order and support through largesse. When that dries up, then you fall back on elements of the security apparatus. You tighten things up, you throw opponents in jail, you kill some people, and you maintain power through a higher dose of coercion. But the point being here that it looked for a while that Venezuelan economic assistance was absolutely critical to the stability of the regime in Nicaragua. But we found, well, when that prop was removed, the regime, the authoritarian resilience, it's still standing.
Thank you, Rich. Well, I think with that, we're going to have to conclude our panel. So I want to thank our panelists, William, Javier, Richard, and Victor, for your excellent presentations.